In this video, I'm going to be using the Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet for drawing this bird in pastels. Now, on the previous projects that I have done using this paper, I know that the pan pastels work really well, but they do require more blending compared to using pastel matte. Now, this isn't a downside, it just means that for this background I was using more pan pastel than I would if using pastel matte. And I decided to just use a solid layer here of the raw umber, and I'm using my round soft tool. Now this works really well, and as you can see, that application is nice and thick. I'm not being too reserved about how much pan pastel I'm using because I'm not going in with my pastel pencils on top. Now if pan pastels are being used for the base of a subject, then I want to be making sure that I'm using significantly less so that I don't run into issues with filling the tooth of the paper. Now with the grass effect that I wanted to create here, I really have to make sure that this is random so that it looks more natural. I don't want my lines to be too vertical and I don't want them to have any symmetry. So they're crossing over in many different directions and overlapping, and I've also got a range of values. Now when drawing any foliage, fur or feathers, whatever it may be, I always recommend to have at least 3. You want a darker shade, a mid-tone and a highlight. That's going to also help with the level of realism and depth that is created. Now that being said, I do personally use far more than 3. There are many times I might have 6 to 10 different values where I build up my layers gradually, but having at least 3 there is a good starting point. Now the last thing I decided to do here is add a little bit of the black pan pastel to the edges so that I could create a vignette effect and keep more of that focus on the bird. Now the one thing to remember when using the black pan pastel like this is it can create more of a grey because it's not really that dark. So if you do want to have something that is darker, I would recommend to come back over the top with your black pastel pencils to enhance that contrast further. But for something like this where I did want my background to be a bit lighter than the values of the bird, this works really well. Now for the last stage of this background, I do just come in with a couple of pastel pencils to enhance some of those lighter values, and there was just about enough tooth of the paper left to do that. But as I've said before, if you are looking to add lots of layers of detail, then using your pastel pencils when lots of pan pastel pigment is applied, it can make those pastels almost like they're gliding over the surface. If your pastel strokes aren't showing up with the pencils, then that is an indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now when working on this paper for this project, I wanted to work slightly differently and avoid using pan pastels for the base layer and just focus more by using my soft pastel pencils if I could for majority of the layering process. Now the reason I decided to do this is on a previous project, I was having issues with those lighter layers being overlapped onto those lighter pan pastel layers. And just for my own curiosity, I wanted to see whether or not the pan pastels were affecting this base foundation process and how those pencils then acted on top of this paper. Now on this previous project that I mentioned where I did run into these issues, that was on the Panda tutorial, and I do have a side-by-side video here on YouTube where I'm showing the differences between the Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet and the pastel matte paper. Now during that project I did notice that some of the harder pencils were struggling with that layering and showing up, so this is one of the reasons why I have stuck with my softer pencils for this bird drawing. Now if that Panda tutorial, that video of that side-by-side difference is of interest, I will link that in the description below. Now the one thing that I do love about the Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet paper is the colour saturation is beautiful. I don't notice any difference or any lacking in that area compared to the pastel matte. Now regardless of the paper that I'm using, I always like to put down more of that lighter vibrant colour first and then I can darken it up later if I need to. This just ensures then that I'm avoiding that chance of muddying up my layers and keeping that bright colour saturation. And as I've said, the Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet paper is beautiful for the colour saturation. The way that it grips that pastel, it really does capture that beautiful colour vibrancy, and that's perfect for this project. Now when I started back with my brighter highlights with my white pastel pencils, I was really impressed with how this area was looking. There wasn't anything here that I was having any issues with. Now, when I started to work with the details on the lower part of the body, that's when I started to notice a couple of problems that I never experienced when working with the pastel mat. So I will get to that aspect once we've got to the next section of this drawing. Now, before that, I obviously worked on the rest of the face, and I'm using here my Cretacolor black to get this really dark. This is the darkest black pastel that I have found, and it really does enhance the level of contrast and therefore more realism in our drawings. Now, one of the other areas that I focus thoroughly in the real-time version of this tutorial, which if that is of interest is all linked in the description below, is how to keep those lighter, more vibrant colours nice and clean when you're working up against a dark, very black section of hair, fur, feather, whatever it may be. Those two areas where they meet, you can end up with a grey very, very quickly, and it can be then difficult to resolve. Now, by making sure that that pencil tip is clean, by keeping those two sections very separate but still overlapping the details at the right point, is one of the best ways that I have found to keep that colour saturation nice and vibrant. Now here, when I'm working back with the black, this is where it can be very easy to start to go over those sections of blue too much. Now, I always say that we don't want any harsh start and stop points between two colours, because it does have a little bit more of a paint by number feel to it, which is not the look we're going for here. And that is demonstrated perfectly on the lower part of that blue cheek section, where that edge is very, very harsh. Now, to fix that, I'm going to come back in with more of my blues, and then I'm going to soften that with the equivalent of a mid-tone. Now, the reason that I prefer that method rather than actually blending this black into the lighter blue is because that is obviously going to have less control. The black's going to maybe get smudged too much into that lighter section, and that's when we can end up with that fuzzier, more muddy look to that edging of the colour. So by making sure there that I'm avoiding that, I'm just able to then keep those markings nice and clean. They're separate, but they're still natural. I've got lots of those details that are still overlapping the black section, and that helps to make it have that very slight fluffy look where those feathers are ruffled up slightly over those two areas. Now, I prefer to work in small sections rather than whole individual layers, just because I find then that I'm able to give each little part the right amount of attention that it needs. I'm less likely to rush through those kinds of techniques, just like what I've mentioned with those edging of the light and dark sections. Now, of course, you can work in whole individual layers. That's absolutely fine if that is your preference. But if you do start to feel like you're rushing or you're getting a little bit overwhelmed, then maybe scaling that down to 1 or 2 square inches can really help. Now, on this section of the drawing, when I started adding the details in the next couple of minutes, this is where I started to experience some of the problems that I also had on the Panda tutorial, not being able to layer my lighter details as easily. Now, I can't stress enough, this is not something that I have when working with pastel matte, and I am trying to find the reason and the workaround with this paper, because apart from that, this paper is working really well with the pastels. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I am using my softer pencils for my base foundation. So here so far, I've only used the Coppola. And up to this point, I was really happy with how these details were turning out. I'm always working with my subtle layers. I'm deliberately not jumping into my lightest pencils first. So this mid-tone grey is working fine. I come back in with this lighter grey and I'm still happy with the results. But when I started to really push the highlights and aim for more of that lighter layer, I was struggling. And I can't stress enough that this is because I'm trying to compare the differences between this paper and pastel matte because there are limitations with adding these lighter layers. Now, these lighter details, they are showing up, but they don't have as much of that softness or brightness that I would expect on the pastel matte, which is why I'm trying desperately to find out a way that we can work around it. Now, if I can get my details to work as effortlessly as I do with the pastel matte on this paper, then I wouldn't hesitate to use this paper for more projects going forward. And the main difference here is I'm trying to avoid using more of those harder pencils, and of course I've deliberately not used my pan pastels for a base layer. And for the next project, I can take what I've learned here in this drawing and then try to adjust something else for another project on this paper and see whether or not I can improve that further. Now, one thing here that is something that is very important is if you're working on an area that is frustrating, you're not getting the desired results, but it doesn't look terrible, then it can be useful to work on another area and come back to it. Sometimes if we start to get really stressed or overwhelmed with a section and we start to overwork it, the details can get muddy, everything can start to get lost. We maybe just add loads and loads more layers, fill that tooth of the paper, and then we can't physically add any more details on top. So to make sure that that doesn't happen, having a rest for half an hour, working on something else maybe, is something that then we're less likely to just continue to make the same mistake over and over. And this is exactly what I've done here. So I'm going to leave that lower section for now, work on the wing, and then I can always come back to it. Now for this section of the drawing, it's quite confusing because there's tiny little feathers here that are indicated at in the reference photo that I physically don't have space to include on this smaller drawing. Now because this is only 6 by 10 and the bird in relation to that size is much smaller because of the background, I need to be realistic with how much detail I can include. So once I've generally mapped out the main colour of the wing with the browns, I'm coming back in with my black and my darker browns on top to hint at the segments of the feathers, but not trying to draw every single one. So I'm still paying attention to how those feathers are directing and the way that they're positioned. The angle of those feathers is important, but I don't have to add in every single one in order to make this look realistic. Because I'm making sure to get my contrast right, the darks are really dark and my highlights here are eventually going to be bright enough, that's going to mean that this has that shape and form, that high level of realism without having to draw in every single feather. Now on smaller drawings, less is more, so if we do start to get carried away and adding more and more details on top, what ends up happening is we lose the layers underneath. Everything gets covered up because obviously on a larger portrait we've got more space to work. So smaller drawings, we do need to always be aware of the amount of detail that we can include before we start making that drawing look less realistic. Now I would love to hear your feedback on this paper. Do you use it? Is it a paper that you enjoy to use, or have you experienced problems? If you have experienced issues and you're not quite sure why they're happening or how to work around it, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments below, and I'm always happy to help if I can. Now something that can also make the layering process easier is to draw the right layer at the right time. Now this twig is a great example, so I've decided to draw this first and then add the feet. The reason being, the feet are gripped around and on top of this element. So by working with what's underneath first, I just feel that helps with much more of a natural look to the drawing. Also, if I'd spent lots of time getting those delicate details on the toes, I may not want to draw this brown colour of the twig right up against that foot. So I might potentially end up with a little bit of a halo around that, and that would also affect the level of realism. So always drawing what is behind something first where you can definitely help simplify that layering process. Now on this section of the drawing, I've really wanted to focus on the softness between the highlight at the top and how it rolls and curves over to the shadow underneath. I am softening that further with a cotton bud here, but the bulk of that has been done with my pastel pencils. Now as long as the right pencil technique is used and light pressure is applied, that pencil works really well as a softening tool rather than actually applying another layer of pastel. This is a technique that I've been using a lot in recent projects, and I really do feel that it enhances the level of softness and depth in the drawings. Now one area where the pencil softening technique comes into its own is these very small narrow sections. This would be very difficult to do when using a cotton bud or a soft tool applicator because those are far thicker. We're more likely to then overblend into the background or the main area of the subject. So being able to soften those layers of pastel with the pencils is another area here where it has such an advantage. Once I've got that level of softness, that's when I can start to focus more on the highlights and shadows and hinting at that extra detail. But as I've mentioned before, I don't want to overdo that here. If I force more detail in, I'm going to cover up the layers underneath, and that's something that would definitely be detrimental to that level of realism. One other thing that's important is Not one element is going to be the same as the other. So here the legs are a different colour. It might be that the eyes in a portrait are a different colour. One highlight might be darker than the other. This is what is also going to help enhance that level of realism and help take your art to the next level. This could be the shadow or a change of the lighting, the way that the light is bounced up from one specific part of the branch. It may then make that colour look warmer or cooler, and it's important to make sure that's captured. The highlight on the left side of the top leg compared to the highlight on the right side. These things here, this bounced light, is something that is going to help enhance that level of depth. So at this stage here, where I had more of this drawing completed, I wasn't as focused or distracted by not getting my highlights as bright on the lower part of the body. Now it still is something that I want to continue to work on with this paper and try to find a fix for it, because I do think I could have captured more depth and realism in that section if this paper allowed me to use more of my lighter layers. But with this here, I was happy with the level of depth and realism, especially for a smaller drawing. And these last few minutes spent here where I'm adjusting my highlights and shadows, just increasing that depth a little bit on that lower part of the body, I felt then I was able to call this finished. Now the issues that I experienced not being able to layer as many of my whiter or lighter details over that section was very frustrating, but it wasn't to the same degree that I experienced on the Panda tutorial. So I do think I've learned a lot with this paper from this project, with the way that I have used those pastels in a slightly different way. And I can take this information now onto the next portrait on the Canson Velvet paper. And I'm really looking forward to adjusting something again and see whether or not I can overcome this issue a little bit more. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a real difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested and drawn along to the real-time version of this, which you are able to do on Pastel Mat as well, because all of the techniques are the same, then I'll link all of the information to my step-by-step tutorials in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.